Hello all, welcome back. In this one, we'll take a look at dependent test cases. So basically, we can have test cases which depends on each other, right? We saw something a little bit in the lecture where we discussed about priority, but there could be an actual scenario where one of my test case is actually dependent on other test case to finish, and it only makes sense to run that test case if the previous test case is done completed, right? In those kind of scenarios, we can actually make a test case dependent on a different test case, and TestNG gives us that power. And then TestNG will make sure that the dependent test case will only run if the previous test case is done executing. So this gives us a very good option. Now let's take an look at the example. I've created the file called testng underscore dependent test, and there we have a setup. This is a before class, and then this is an after class, and I should just remove this. It is just from a previous class. So now we have these two methods for before class, after class, and then we have four test methods: test method 1, 2, 3, 4. Now let's say my test method 1 depends on test method 2. So by default, they'll run in the order test method 1, 2, 3, 4. But if my test method 1 depends on test method 2 and test method 3 depends on test method 1, then I can actually make them dependent. And let's say test method 4 is independent. It doesn't need any other test case to run. So we can actually leave it. So we don't have to give priority to every single test method. That's a very good option. Maybe I have 100 test cases. I don't want to give a priority to all the 100 test cases like 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 and all that. So what I can do here is I can only add an attribute for the test cases which are really dependent, and I can leave everything aside. So other test cases would just run in any order, but my dependent test cases would be run in the order, not exactly the order, but they would run based on their requirement. If test method 1 has to be run before test method 2, then it will run based on the dependent attribute that we will provide. Now you remember that we had a class to test, some class to test, and now we already have the setup classes and everything before we were actually creating the object in every test method. So now what we can do here is we can actually create the objects in the before class, so we don't have to create object in every test method. What I can do here is I have to write the import statement. So import app code dot some class to test, and then I can create an object here. So some class to test, and then obj equals to new some class to test. Now this is an object created. So sorry, I should not be creating the object here. So I should only be defining it here, and then I should be creating the object inside the before class. And then this guy is set up. So I created the object in the before class. Now what I can do here is I can use that object in every method. So I'm just gonna call maybe one test here. So maybe we will use int result, and we will call obj dot sum numbers. This is the most simple one, and I'm gonna sum 1 and 2. So we expect an output as 3. So let's do assert dot assert, sorry for the typo, assert dot assert equals, and int type we're gonna do, and expected 3, actual 3. So it should run our test case. Sorry, I should just put the result here. So expected is the result, and actual is the result, and expected is 3. What I'm expecting is 3, and result is going to give me the sum of these numbers returned from the method. So obviously 1 and 2, if the method is correct, it's going to return 1 plus 2 as 3. So this is just a sample test method. I have used it for a particular purpose that I'll show you. So now let's make test method 1 depends on, test method 2 depends on test method 1. So what I can use here is that depends on methods. So this is the attribute that I can use, and in curly braces, and we can use here double quotes, we can provide the name of the method where it depends. So you know what, actually I should be doing the other way. So I should make test method 1 dependent on test method 2, just to showcase that it is honored. Otherwise test method 1 is obviously going to run before test method 2 because of the name alphabetical order. And let's copy these statements down to our test method 2. So now we have it like this. So what we are doing here is our test method 1 is dependent on test method 2, and now let's make this guy test method 3 depends on test method 1, which makes sense, right? So now test method 2 should execute first, then test method 1, and then test method 3. So, and test method 4 is independent, it should run just wherever it feels like. So now let me just right click and run the code, run as TestNG test, and everything is successful. Test method 2 ran first, then 4, because 4 can take any place, and then 1. So it doesn't have to run exactly after 2. Test method 1 ran after 2. In between, any other method can execute. So 4 got executed, then 1 got executed, and 3 depends on 1, so then 3 got executed. So TestNG honors it, whatever we provided here, and it will make sure that the dependent test method will execute afterwards. So 1 was dependent on 2, so that's why it got executed afterwards. Now let's take a scenario. What happens? So currently everything was successful, everything is green, 2, 4, 1 and 3. And now let's make this also maybe dependent on 1. So this guy depends on maybe 3. So now this is gonna run at the last. So 2, and this guy doesn't depend on anybody, and then this one depends on 1, and this one depends on 3. Now let's make sure that test method 2 fails. Let's do it. So instead of 3, I'm expecting, let's say 2, and then it will fail. And then let's run the test case. Run as a TestNG test case, and what happens? So this method got failed. Test method 2 is failed. It is expecting 2, but it found 3, which is actually correct. And at the bottom we can see that test method 1 got skipped, test method 3 got skipped, and test method 4 got skipped, because they were all dependent on each other. And if this method got failed, then the dependent method will be skipped. The dependent one is not failed, it's just skipped. And if I remove it from test method 4, let's say just for fun we remove it, then we will see a different output. So now what happens is test method 4 is executed, it is passed because it was not dependent on anything. Test method 2 is failed, obviously we failed it intentionally. 1 is skipped because 1 is dependent on 2, and 3 is skipped because 3 is dependent on 1. Finally we can see here 4 test methods were there, 1 failed and 2 skipped. That's what we can see here also. So this is the output. Now let's say that I still want to run my other test cases. I don't want to skip them. Maybe let them fail if there is some issue, but I don't want to skip them. So what we can do here is we can actually use the always run attribute. So this is actually very helpful. Always run equals to true. So if I put always run for test method 1, which is dependent on test method 2, even if the test method 2 fails, it should run test method 1. Let me just right click and run it. And now let's see the output. So what happens is test method 4 is successful. 1 still got executed because we say we still want to run it. Please always run it. Doesn't matter if test method 2 fails or it's successful, still run it. And since test method 3 was dependent on test method 1, it ran test method 3 also, and finally test method 2 failed. And that's what we intentionally failed. So I wanted to show you two things here, that we can make test cases dependent, and if the main test method fails, then the dependent test method will be skipped. But if we still want to run it always, then we can actually use always run attribute. So that's about it. Please download the code, practice, and let me know if you have any questions. I'll see you in the next lecture, guys, and thanks for learning this one. Thanks.